You are standing in Paris in the winter of 1811, watching as Napoleon Bonaparte contemplates a decision that will alter the course of European history. The empire he has built over the past decade stretches from Spain to Poland, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean. France dominates the continent militarily, politically, and economically. Yet Napoleon is not satisfied. He is troubled by Russia, and that trouble will lead him to make the most consequential strategic error of his career. The source of tension lies in the continental system, Napoleon's economic blockade against Britain. Since France cannot invade the British Islands, British naval supremacy makes this impossible. Napoleon has attempted to defeat Britain through commercial strangulation. Every port in Europe under French influence is closed to British goods. Ships trading with Britain are barred from European harbors. The continental system is Napoleon's answer to British control of the seas, an attempt to use Europe's combined economic power to force British submission. The system requires universal compliance to function effectively. If major European states ignore the blockade, British goods find markets, British commerce continues, and the entire strategy fails. This is precisely what is happening with Russia. Tsar Alexander I initially accepted the continental system as part of the treaties of Tilsit in 1807, agreements that divided Europe into French and Russian spheres of influence. But by 1811, Russia is openly violating the blockade. Russian ports admit British ships. Russian merchants trade British goods. The continental system's credibility is collapsing. You observe that Napoleon faces what appears to be a strategic necessity. If Russia can defy the blockade with impunity, other states will follow. The entire architecture of economic warfare against Britain will crumble. Napoleon believes he must enforce the continental system through military means, demonstrating that defiance carries consequences. From his perspective, invading Russia is not optional but rather required to maintain the strategic framework upon which French dominance rests. This is the logic that drives the decision, a logic that seems compelling when examined from Paris, but that will prove disastrously flawed when tested against Russian geography and climate. The personal relationship between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander has deteriorated significantly since Tilsit. The two emperors met on a raft in the Niemen River in 1807 and agreed to divide Europe between them. At that time, Alexander was recently defeated, Russia was diplomatically isolated, and cooperation with France seemed necessary. But 4 years have passed, and circumstances have changed. Russia has recovered from its defeats. Russian nobles resent the continental system because it damages their grain exports to Britain, their primary source of foreign revenue. Alexander faces domestic pressure to abandon the French alliance. Beyond economic issues, political tensions strain the relationship. Napoleon's creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw from former Polish territories alarms Russia. Poland had been partitioned between Russia, Prussia, and Austria in the late 18th century, and Russians fear that Napoleon intends to resurrect an independent Polish state that would threaten Russian security. Napoleon's marriage to Marie-Louise, daughter of the Austrian emperor, in 1810 signals a shift in alliances away from Russia. Alexander feels increasingly isolated and views French expansion with growing concern. Diplomatic efforts to resolve these tensions fail. Napoleon demands that Russia enforce the continental system strictly and cease trading with Britain. Alexander insists that Russian economic interests require some flexibility, that Russia cannot sacrifice its prosperity for French strategic goals. Neither emperor is willing to compromise on fundamental issues. By late 1811, both sides are preparing for war, though neither has formally declared it. The drift toward conflict seems inexorable. You notice that Napoleon's decision to invade is reinforced by his previous successes. He has defeated every major European army he has faced: Austrian, Prussian, Russian. The Russian army was beaten at Austerlitz in 1805 and at Friedland in 1807. Napoleon believes that Russian military power is inferior to French military power, that another campaign will produce another decisive victory, and that victory will force Alexander to return to the continental system and accept French dominance. This confidence is not entirely unfounded. Napoleon's military record is extraordinary, but it does not account for the unique challenges that Russia presents. Russia is unlike any theater where Napoleon has previously campaigned. It is vast beyond European comprehension, stretching from Poland to the Pacific, from the Arctic to Central Asia. The distances are immense. The population is scattered. The roads are poor. The climate is extreme. Previous campaigns, in Italy, Germany, Austria, occurred in relatively compact theaters with good infrastructure, where decisive battles could be fought near capitals or major cities, and where victory led directly to political settlement. Russia offers none of these advantages. Moreover, Russia's autocratic political system means that military defeat does not automatically translate into political surrender. Tsar Alexander, unlike the rulers of constitutional states, does not face domestic pressure to make peace after battlefield losses. He can continue fighting indefinitely as long as he retains control of the state apparatus and the army remains loyal. This gives Russia strategic resilience that Napoleon does not fully appreciate. He assumes that a decisive military victory will force negotiation, just as it has in previous campaigns. He does not consider that Russia might simply refuse to negotiate, might absorb losses and continue resistance. As 1812 begins, Napoleon commits to the invasion. He frames it publicly as a defensive war, claiming that Russia is preparing to attack French interests and that France must act preemptively. He presents it as a limited campaign meant to restore the alliance and enforce the continental system, not as an attempt to conquer or partition Russia. Whether Napoleon genuinely believes these justifications or merely uses them for propaganda purposes is unclear. What is clear is that he underestimates the challenges ahead and overestimates his ability to achieve strategic objectives through military force. The decision to invade Russia is made by Napoleon personally. His marshals and advisors express concerns. They question whether the strategic benefit justifies the risks. They point out the logistical difficulties and the enormous distances involved. But Napoleon dismisses these concerns. He is supremely confident in his military genius and in his ability to overcome obstacles through superior strategy and battlefield skill. He has done it before repeatedly. He believes he will do it again. This confidence, justified by past successes, blinds him to the reality that Russia is fundamentally different from previous opponents, that the scale and nature of the challenge exceed what military brilliance alone can overcome. You watch now as Napoleon assembles the largest European army yet gathered for a single campaign. The force that will invade Russia in June 1812 is unprecedented in size and composition. It numbers over 600,000 men, drawn not just from France but from across the Napoleonic Empire. This army represents the culmination of Napoleon's military system, the mobilization of an entire continent's resources for a single strategic objective. Yet the very size of this force creates problems that will prove insurmountable. The core of the Grand Army consists of French troops, perhaps 300,000 soldiers drawn from France proper and the annexed territories along the Rhine and in Italy. These are veteran soldiers, men who have fought in previous campaigns, who are accustomed to the demands of military life under Napoleon's command. They form the most reliable portion of the army, the units Napoleon will depend on for decisive actions. French troops are organized into corps, self-contained formations of infantry, cavalry, and artillery that can operate independently or combine for major battles. Beyond the French corps, the Grand Army includes substantial contingents from Napoleon's satellite states and reluctant allies. The Kingdom of Italy contributes troops. The Confederation of the Rhine provides German soldiers from Bavaria, Saxony, Westphalia, and numerous smaller states. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw supplies Polish troops eager to fight Russia, Poland's historical oppressor. Austria and Prussia, recently defeated by France and now compelled to cooperate, each provide corps that will operate on the flanks of the main advance. Even Spain, despite the ongoing Peninsular War, contributes some forces. You observe that this multinational composition creates inherent weaknesses. The non-French contingents vary greatly in quality, training, motivation, and reliability. Polish troops fight willingly, seeing the campaign as liberation from Russian domination. German troops are more ambivalent, serving because their rulers have no choice. Austrian and Prussian troops are deeply unreliable, their countries having been forced into alliance against their will. These soldiers have no enthusiasm for French objectives and will defect at the first opportunity. The Grand Army is impressive in numbers but fragile in cohesion. Supplying this enormous force presents extraordinary challenges. A single soldier requires approximately 2 pounds of bread or hardtack daily, plus meat, vegetables, salt, and other provisions. A horse requires 20 pounds of fodder. 600,000 men and their horses consume vast quantities of food every day. Additionally, the army needs ammunition, spare equipment, medical supplies, replacement clothing, and countless other items. Moving all these supplies forward as the army advances into Russia will require thousands of wagons, hundreds of thousands of draft animals, and perfect organizational execution. Napoleon's staff develops an elaborate supply system. Massive supply depots are established in Poland near the Russian border, stockpiled with months' worth of provisions. Wagon trains are organized to move supplies from these depots forward to the advancing army. Bakeries are established to produce bread. Herds of cattle are driven along with the army to provide fresh meat. The plan is comprehensive on paper, designed to support the army deep into Russia. But it assumes that the supply system will function smoothly, that roads will be adequate, that weather will cooperate, and that the campaign will not last too long. Each of these assumptions will prove false. The logistical preparations reveal Napoleon's awareness of the challenge. He spends months organizing supplies, far longer than for previous campaigns. He understands that Russia's size and poor infrastructure require more careful preparation. Yet even this extraordinary effort proves insufficient. The distances are too great, the roads too poor, the climate too harsh, the campaign too prolonged. No amount of preparation could have created a supply system capable of sustaining 600,000 men hundreds of miles inside Russia through a brutal winter. The task exceeds the organizational capabilities of early 19th century armies. You notice that the army's size is both its strength and its fatal weakness. Such a massive force intimidates enemies and can overwhelm opposition through sheer numbers. But it also consumes supplies at a rate that makes sustained operations far from supply bases nearly impossible. A smaller army could be supplied more easily and could move more quickly. Napoleon chooses overwhelming force to ensure decisive victory, but in doing so, he creates logistical problems that will destroy the army regardless of battlefield success. The cavalry is particularly important for this campaign. Napoleon assembles approximately 80,000 cavalry, an enormous mounted force by the standards of the era. Cavalry performs reconnaissance, screens the army's movements, pursues defeated enemies, and delivers decisive charges in battle. The campaign's success depends on cavalry finding and fixing the Russian army so that Napoleon can bring his infantry to battle. But cavalry requires enormous quantities of fodder. Horses cannot survive on foraged grass alone, they need grain. Supplying 80,000 horses with grain throughout a campaign deep in Russia will prove impossible. Artillery also features prominently in the Grand Army's organization. Napoleon is an artillerist by training, and he has always emphasized firepower in his tactical system. The invasion force includes over 1,000 guns, from light field pieces to heavy siege artillery. These guns provide the bombardment that softens enemy positions before infantry assaults. But artillery is heavy and slow-moving. Each gun requires multiple horses to pull it, plus wagons to carry ammunition. The artillery train adds enormously to the army's supply requirements and slows its movement. The command structure of the Grand Army reflects Napoleon's method of personal control combined with delegation to trusted subordinates. He divides the army into wings and corps, each commanded by a marshal or senior general. These officers, Davout, Ney, Murat, Eugene de Beauharnais, and others, are experienced commanders who understand Napoleon's strategic intentions and can execute operations with some independence. Yet Napoleon retains personal direction of major decisions, planning the overall campaign and expecting his subordinates to implement his designs. This system has worked well in compact theaters but will be strained by Russian distances. As the army concentrates near the Russian border in May and June of 1812, the soldiers are in generally good condition. They have been well fed during the build-up phase. Their equipment is serviceable. Morale is reasonable, though not enthusiastic. Veterans understand the campaign will be difficult. Many have fought in the brutal Peninsular War and have learned that not all campaigns end in quick victory. But they trust Napoleon's generalship and expect that, as in previous wars, French military superiority will prevail. They do not yet understand that they are marching into a vastness that will swallow them. You stand at the border as June begins, watching this immense military machine prepare to cross into Russia. The Grand Army represents the peak of Napoleonic military organization, the largest force Napoleon will ever command, assembled with extraordinary effort and supplied with unprecedented resources. It seems invincible. Yet it is marching toward destruction, not through any single catastrophic defeat but through the gradual erosion that comes from operating in an environment that exceeds the logistical and organizational capacities of the age. The invasion is about to begin, and with it, the beginning of the end of Napoleon's empire. You observe as the Grand Army crosses the Niemen River on June 24, 1812, entering Russian territory. The crossing occurs near Kovno, at multiple points along the river. Engineers have constructed pontoon bridges, temporary structures of boats and planks that allow the massive army to flow across the water. The operation is impressively organized, with different corps crossing at designated locations to avoid congestion. By June 26, most of the army has entered Russia. There has been no battle, no resistance at the border. The Russians have simply withdrawn. This absence of opposition is the first indication that the campaign will not follow the pattern of previous wars. In past invasions of enemy territory, Napoleon encountered defending armies near the border. Battles occurred within days or weeks of crossing into hostile country. The campaign's first phase typically involved maneuvering to force battle under favorable conditions, then winning that battle decisively. But the Russians are nowhere to be found. Reconnaissance reports that Russian forces are retreating eastward, refusing contact. Napoleon's cavalry ranges forward but cannot bring the Russian army to battle. The Russian strategy is not fully coordinated at this stage, but it develops logically from circumstances. Russia has two main armies near the border, the First Army under Barclay de Tolly and the Second Army under Bagration, totaling perhaps 200,000 men. These forces are significantly outnumbered by Napoleon's massive army. Attempting to defend at the border would invite destruction. The logical response is to retreat, avoiding battle until Russian forces can concentrate and until Napoleon's army is stretched thin by advancing deep into Russian territory. Whether this strategy is deliberately planned or emerges from necessity is debated, but its effect is the same. Napoleon marches forward finding no enemy to fight. You notice how this strategy frustrates Napoleon's operational method. His usual approach involves rapid movement to outmaneuver the enemy, forcing battle under conditions that favor French tactical superiority. His victories typically result from superior maneuver followed by decisive engagement. But if the enemy refuses battle and simply retreats, maneuver accomplishes nothing. Napoleon can occupy territory, but occupation without defeating the enemy army achieves no strategic result. The Russians are denying him the decisive battle that would force negotiation and end the campaign quickly. The Grand Army advances through Lithuania and into Russia proper. The territory is poor, with scattered villages and few large towns. The roads are unpaved tracks that turn to mud when it rains. The advancing army consumes local food supplies within days, leaving nothing for following units. Soldiers begin to forage aggressively, stripping the countryside of anything edible. This devastation extends miles on either side of the line of march. Peasants flee, driving their livestock deeper into Russia, leaving the advancing French to find abandoned villages and empty fields. Supply wagons fall behind immediately. The poor roads slow their movement. The distances grow as the army advances. Fresh supplies from the border depots take longer to reach forward units. Soldiers begin living off what they can forage rather than waiting for official rations. This works initially because Lithuania has some food available, but it creates dangerous habits. Discipline erodes as soldiers scatter to search for food. Units lose cohesion. Officers struggle to maintain order when men are hungry and authorized supplies have not arrived. The horses suffer even more than the men. Cavalry and artillery horses require enormous quantities of fodder, and they cannot forage effectively while maintaining military operations. Horses begin to weaken from insufficient food within the first weeks of the campaign. Some die, and their carcasses are left along the roadside. The loss of horses cripples reconnaissance, reduces cavalry effectiveness, and slows the artillery train. Without adequate cavalry, Napoleon cannot locate the retreating Russian army. Without mobile artillery, he cannot fight effectively even if he finds the enemy. Weather becomes a factor almost immediately. Late June brings heat and drought, creating dust clouds that choke men and animals. Water becomes scarce. Soldiers break ranks to drink from streams and ponds, often consuming contaminated water. Dysentery spreads through the army, a debilitating illness that weakens men and forces them to fall out of the marching columns. Thousands sicken in the first weeks. Field hospitals overflow. Medical supplies run short. The army is losing strength before fighting any significant engagement. You observe that Napoleon drives the army forward relentlessly, trying to close with the retreating Russians before they can escape entirely. He divides his forces, sending corps on different routes to envelope the Russian armies. But coordination across vast distances proves difficult. Corps commanders cannot communicate quickly with Napoleon or with each other. Opportunities to trap Russian forces dissipate as the Russians slip away from encirclement attempts. By mid-July, the Grand Army has advanced hundreds of miles into Russia but has achieved no decisive result. The city of Vilna is occupied in late June, then Vitebsk in late July. These cities provide some supplies and brief rest for the army, but they also reveal the scale of devastation the advancing force creates. Everything useful is consumed. Buildings are stripped for firewood. Food stocks are exhausted. The local population is hostile or has fled. Napoleon establishes Vilna as a major supply depot and administrative center, but the distance from Vilna to the advancing army grows daily, making supply lines ever more tenuous. By early August, Napoleon has penetrated 300 miles into Russia. The Grand Army has shrunk significantly. Perhaps 100,000 men have been lost to disease, desertion, straggling, and the need to garrison supply lines. The horses are in terrible condition, with tens of thousands already dead. The supply system is collapsing under the strain of distance and poor infrastructure. Yet Napoleon has not fought the decisive battle he seeks. The Russian armies remain intact, retreating before him, refusing the engagement that would allow him to dictate terms. Napoleon faces a strategic dilemma. He can halt the advance, consolidate his position, establish supply lines, and wait for the Russians to attack him. This would be prudent but would concede the initiative and might allow the Russians to receive reinforcements or wait for winter. Alternatively, he can continue advancing, hoping to force battle before his army is completely worn down. He chooses to continue, believing that Moscow, the ancient capital, is a prize the Russians cannot abandon, that they will have to fight to defend it. This decision commits the Grand Army to advance even deeper into Russia, stretching supply lines even further, and accepting even greater logistical risk. You stand with the army in early August 1812, roughly 6 weeks into the campaign. Already the Grand Army is a shadow of the force that crossed the Niemen. It has lost more men to disease and exhaustion than to enemy action. The cavalry is depleted. The supply system is failing. Soldiers are hungry and tired. Yet no decisive battle has occurred. The Russians continue to retreat, drawing the French ever deeper into a vast country where distance and climate are more dangerous than enemy soldiers. The campaign that Napoleon expected to last a few weeks has already stretched beyond reasonable limits, and Moscow is still far ahead, beckoning like a mirage that promises everything but may deliver nothing. You continue forward with the Grand Army as it advances through August 1812, pursuing Russian forces that remain tantalizingly out of reach. The landscape through which the army passes is increasingly desolate. Villages are abandoned, granaries are empty, fields have been burned. The Russians, whether following deliberate policy or acting from spontaneous desperation, are denying resources to the invading army. This scorched earth approach transforms the Russian countryside into a hostile environment where survival becomes as much a challenge as military operations. The term scorched earth suggests systematic destruction, but the reality is more complex. Russian commanders do issue orders to remove or destroy supplies that might benefit the French. Peasants, faced with an approaching army known to requisition everything useful, hide food, drive livestock into forests, or burn what they cannot save. Some destruction is planned, much is spontaneous. The result is that the advancing French find less and less to sustain themselves. The army becomes increasingly dependent on supplies from rear depots, but those supplies cannot keep pace with the advance. Smolensk, a major city on the road to Moscow, becomes Napoleon's next objective. Smolensk is strategically important, sitting on the Dnieper River and controlling routes east. More importantly, it offers the possibility of forcing battle. Intelligence suggests that Russian forces are concentrating near Smolensk, possibly preparing to defend the city. Napoleon hopes that here, finally, he can bring the Russian army to battle and win the decisive engagement that will force Tsar Alexander to negotiate. The approach to Smolensk involves complex maneuvering. Napoleon attempts to envelope the Russian forces by crossing the Dnieper River south of the city and cutting their line of retreat toward Moscow. If successful, this maneuver would trap the Russian army against the river and force it to fight or surrender. But the operation requires rapid movement across difficult terrain, and the Grand Army is no longer capable of rapid movement. The horses are weak, the men are exhausted, and the corps do not coordinate effectively across the distances involved. You observe the Battle of Smolensk on August 16th and 17th. The Russians do defend the city initially, and fierce fighting occurs. French troops assault the walls and suburbs of Smolensk while artillery bombards the city. Fires break out, and much of Smolensk burns during the battle. Thousands of casualties occur on both sides. For a moment, it appears Napoleon has achieved the engagement he seeks. But then the Russians evacuate the city during the night, withdrawing eastward in good order. Napoleon occupies a burning ruin, having won a tactical victory that achieves no strategic result. The Russian army escapes once again. The aftermath of Smolensk forces a moment of decision. Napoleon considers halting the campaign here, establishing Smolensk as the forward operating base, and waiting for spring to resume operations. His marshals favor this course. They point out that the army is exhausted, that supplies are inadequate, that continuing risks catastrophe. Smolensk could serve as a defensible position where the army could rest, refit, and prepare for a renewed offensive next year. This advice is sound, but Napoleon rejects it. Several factors drive Napoleon to continue. He believes that Moscow is within reach and that capturing the ancient capital will have psychological and political impact sufficient to force Russian surrender. He fears that halting will be interpreted as weakness, that European allies will defect if France appears unable to defeat Russia. He also seems driven by a kind of momentum, an inability to accept that the campaign is not proceeding as planned, a determination to achieve his objective regardless of cost. This psychological factor is crucial. Napoleon has never failed to achieve his military goals once committed to them. He cannot admit, perhaps even to himself, that this campaign is fundamentally different, that the normal rules do not apply in Russia. The decision to continue beyond Smolensk is the point of no return. From Smolensk to Moscow is another 250 miles. Supply lines are already stretched beyond capacity. The army is significantly reduced. Perhaps 150,000 men remain in fighting condition, less than a quarter of the force that entered Russia. The horses are dying in large numbers, crippling cavalry and artillery. Winter is approaching, though how soon and how severe remains uncertain. Every rational calculation suggests consolidation, yet Napoleon orders the advance to continue. You notice that communication with France has become irregular. Messages take weeks to travel between Moscow and Paris. Napoleon receives reports about European affairs but cannot respond quickly to developments. This isolation is dangerous. While Napoleon focuses on Russia, his enemies elsewhere, Britain in Spain, restive populations in Germany and Italy, watch for signs of weakness. The longer the Russian campaign lasts without resolution, the more opportunity exists for opposition to develop. Napoleon's empire depends on the perception of invincibility. The Russian campaign is undermining that perception with each passing week. The army's condition continues to deteriorate as it advances from Smolensk toward Moscow. Discipline is breaking down. Soldiers forage aggressively, sometimes violently. Stragglers fall behind and are killed by Russian partisans or die of exhaustion. Desertion increases, particularly among the non-French contingents. German and Italian soldiers disappear from their units, either heading home or seeking refuge with Russian civilians. The multinational character of the Grand Army, impressive at the campaign start, has become a liability as soldiers with little commitment to French objectives abandon the cause. Disease remains a constant drain on strength. Dysentery, typhus, and various fevers spread through the army. The field hospitals are overwhelmed, and seriously ill soldiers are often left behind as the army advances. Some recover and rejoin their units, most do not. The sick and wounded left in garrison towns behind the advancing army create a trail of misery across Russia. These men are vulnerable to partisan attacks, short on supplies, and often unable to receive adequate medical care. Thousands die in these improvised hospitals, far from home, for a cause they may not have understood or supported. The mood among the soldiers shifts from confidence to grim determination. The veterans understand that the campaign has gone badly wrong, that they are far from home in a hostile country with inadequate supplies and no clear prospect of victory. Yet they continue because there is no alternative. Retreat without orders is desertion. Staying in place means starvation. The only option is to continue forward, hoping that Moscow will somehow provide the resolution that has eluded them thus far. This is not enthusiasm or confidence, but rather the momentum of an army that has committed itself and cannot turn back. As September begins, the Grand Army approaches the area around Borodino, where intelligence reports that the Russians have finally decided to make a stand. A new commander, Kutuzov, has replaced Barclay de Tolly, and Kutuzov is under pressure from Russian nobles and officers to stop retreating and defend Moscow. The battle that Napoleon has sought since June is finally about to occur. Yet the army that will fight this battle is a fraction of the force that entered Russia, worn down by disease, hunger, and the immense distances it has traveled. The decisive engagement is coming, but the Grand Army may be too weakened to exploit victory even if it is achieved. You arrive at the field of Borodino on September 7, 1812, where the Russian army has finally chosen to make its stand. The position is formidable. The Russians have erected earthwork fortifications, positioned artillery on commanding heights, and deployed their army in depth. This is not a desperate last stand but a carefully prepared defensive position. The Russian army numbers approximately 120,000 men, facing a French force that Napoleon can field of about 130,000. The numerical advantage that the Grand Army enjoyed at the campaign start has disappeared. The battle begins early in the morning with a massive artillery bombardment. Napoleon commands more than 500 guns, and they open fire on the Russian positions, attempting to soften the defenses before infantry assaults. The Russians reply with their own artillery, creating a thunderous cannonade that can be heard for miles. This is not the place for detailed description of combat, but you can observe the general patterns. The French launch repeated attacks on key Russian positions, particularly a fortification called the Great Redoubt in the center of the Russian line. The fighting is intense and costly. French troops capture positions, are counterattacked, and must fight again to hold what they have taken. You notice that Napoleon fights this battle differently than his previous engagements. Normally, he seeks to maneuver and exploit weaknesses, using cavalry and infantry in coordinated movements to envelope and destroy enemy formations. At Borodino, he relies primarily on frontal assaults and artillery bombardment. The creativity and flexibility that characterize his earlier victories are absent. Perhaps he is cautious because he cannot afford heavy losses so far from France. Perhaps the army is too exhausted and disorganized for complex maneuvers. Perhaps Napoleon himself is affected by illness. Some accounts suggest he is suffering from a painful urinary infection during the battle. Whatever the reason, Borodino is a battle of attrition rather than maneuver. By evening, the French hold the field. Russian forces have withdrawn from their forward positions and retreated several miles. French casualties are enormous, perhaps 30,000 killed and wounded. Russian casualties are even higher, perhaps 40,000 or more. Both armies have been savaged by a full day of brutal combat. Napoleon can claim victory because the Russians withdrew, but it is a victory that achieves no decisive result. The Russian army remains intact, retreating in good order toward Moscow. It has not been destroyed or captured. It will continue to exist as a fighting force. The day after Borodino, Napoleon expects the Russians to offer battle again or to seek terms. Instead, they continue retreating. Kutuzov recognizes that his army, though bloodied, is still functional. He also understands that Moscow, while symbolically important, is not essential to Russian resistance. Better to preserve the army and continue the war than to risk destruction defending a city. This decision will prove strategically sound, but it is controversial in Russia, where many view abandoning Moscow as shameful. The Grand Army advances toward Moscow, which is now undefended. On September 14th, Napoleon enters the city from the west while Russian forces evacuate to the east. Moscow is largely empty. most of the population has fled, taking portable valuables with them. Napoleon establishes headquarters in the Kremlin, the ancient fortress at the city's heart. For a moment, it seems that the campaign's objective has been achieved. Moscow is captured. Surely now the Tsar will negotiate. That night, fires begin in various parts of Moscow. The fires spread rapidly because most buildings are wooden. Soon, much of the city is ablaze. The fire burns for several days, destroying perhaps 3/4 of Moscow's structures. The cause of the fire is disputed. The French claim that the Russian military governor deliberately burned the city to deny its resources to Napoleon. Russian accounts suggest that the fires started accidentally or were set by French looters. Likely, the truth involves both deliberate destruction and accidental spread. Whatever the cause, the result is that Napoleon occupies a burnt-out shell rather than an intact city. You observe Napoleon waiting in Moscow for 5 weeks, from mid-September to mid-October. This period is one of the strangest in his career. He has achieved his stated objective, capturing Moscow, yet it has brought no strategic benefit. The Tsar sends no peace envoys. Alexander has left St. Petersburg for the interior, beyond reach. Russian forces remain in the field, harassing French supply lines and gathering strength. Meanwhile, Napoleon sits in the ruins of Moscow, seemingly paralyzed by indecision. The Grand Army deteriorates during this Moscow interlude. Discipline collapses entirely as soldiers loot the ruined city for anything valuable or useful. Some find wine cellars and drink heavily. Others search for warm clothing as the weather turns cold. Military order breaks down. Units lose cohesion. Officers cannot control their men. The army, instead of resting and recovering, degenerates into a mob of looters living amid ruins. Supplies remain desperately inadequate. While Moscow's remaining storehouses provide some resources, they are insufficient for an army even of reduced size. The supply line from Smolensk is under constant attack by Russian partisans and Cossacks. Wagons are captured or destroyed. Supply convoys require heavy escorts, reducing the troops available for other duties. The army in Moscow is not being resupplied effectively, which means it is consuming whatever is available locally without building up reserves for the return journey. The weather begins to change. September is still relatively warm, but by early October, nights are cold. Frost appears. The Russian autumn is brief, and winter comes early in 1812. Napoleon's army is not equipped for severe cold. Most soldiers have only the uniforms they wore when the campaign began in June. There are no winter coats, no adequate gloves or boots, no provisions for extreme cold weather. The assumption was that the campaign would end before winter. That assumption is proving catastrophically wrong. By mid-October, Napoleon recognizes that he must leave Moscow. Staying through winter is impossible. The city cannot support the army, and being isolated deep in Russia during winter would invite disaster. But leaving means retreating, admitting that the campaign has failed to achieve its objective. Napoleon sends peace feelers to the Tsar, offering to evacuate Russia in exchange for recognition of French territorial gains elsewhere in Europe. Alexander does not reply. The silence makes clear that Russia will not negotiate while French troops occupy Russian territory. On October 19, Napoleon orders the army to begin the retreat from Moscow. The plan is to take a southern route back to Smolensk, following different roads than the advance used, hoping to find regions that have not been stripped of supplies. The army that marches out of Moscow numbers perhaps 100,000 men. It is burdened with wagons loaded with plunder. Soldiers have collected valuables from the ruins and are trying to carry them home. This plunder slows the march and will prove worthless. You watch the retreat begin, and you can sense that something fundamental has shifted. The army that entered Russia was confident, well supplied, and disciplined. The army leaving Moscow is defeated in spirit though not in fact, poorly supplied, and barely controlled. The Grand Army has fought one major battle at Borodino and captured Moscow, yet it has achieved nothing of strategic value. Now it must retreat hundreds of miles through a hostile country with winter approaching and supplies exhausted. The campaign has become a test of survival rather than a military operation. The beginning of the end is becoming the actuality of collapse. You move now with the retreating Grand Army as it leaves Moscow and heads southwest toward Kaluga, attempting to follow a route that will avoid the devastated corridor of the advance. Napoleon hopes to find unspoiled territory where food and forage might be available. The army moves slowly, burdened by wagons of plunder and by thousands of sick and wounded soldiers. Discipline remains poor. The retreat is more a migration of desperate men than an organized military withdrawal. Within days, this plan collapses. Russian forces block the southern route at the town of Malyaroslavets. A battle occurs on October 24, indecisive but sufficient to convince Napoleon that continuing south is too risky. He orders the army to turn back toward the northern route, the same roads used during the advance. This means retreating through territory already stripped of resources, through villages already burned, along roads lined with the debris of the advancing army. The soldiers realize what this means. There will be no food. The retreat will be a test of endurance. The weather, which has been cold but manageable, now turns severe. Snow begins to fall in early November. Temperatures drop below freezing and continue to fall. This is the beginning of one of the coldest winters in Russian memory. The Grand Army, completely unprepared for such conditions, begins to suffer immediately. Men wearing summer uniforms are exposed to temperatures far below zero. Their hands and feet freeze. Frostbite becomes epidemic. Soldiers who fall behind die of exposure within hours. You observe the brutal logic of cold weather on an unprepared army. A soldier begins the day capable of marching. As the day progresses and cold penetrates inadequate clothing, he weakens. He falls behind the column. Once separated from his unit, he has little chance of survival. He might find shelter in an abandoned building and freeze to death during the night. He might be killed by pursuing Russian forces or partisans. He might simply collapse on the road and die where he falls. The roads become lined with corpses, frozen in the positions where they died, creating a trail of death that marks the army's retreat. Horses die in even greater numbers than men. Cold affects horses severely, particularly when they are already weakened by inadequate fodder. When horses die, the wagons they pulled must be abandoned. Artillery pieces are left beside the road because there are no horses to pull them. The army is shedding equipment, losing its capacity to fight even if it wanted to. Cavalry cease to function as mounted troops because there are no horses. Cavalrymen walk alongside infantry, their expensive training worthless without mounts. The supply system, already failing, collapses entirely. Wagons cannot keep up with the retreating army. The depots established during the advance are overrun by Russian forces or simply bypassed by retreating units that take different routes. Soldiers receive no official rations and must survive on whatever they can find. In the devastated landscape of the retreat route, there is almost nothing to find. Men become desperate. They kill horses for meat. They search abandoned villages for anything edible. Some resort to cannibalism, though this is rare and hidden. Hunger dominates everything. Discipline erodes completely. Units dissolve as soldiers focus entirely on survival. Officers cannot control men who are starving and freezing. The army fragments into groups of varying sizes, all moving west but no longer functioning as a coherent military organization. Some soldiers remain with their units, maintaining some semblance of military order. Others join informal groups formed around whoever seems capable of leadership. Many become isolated individuals, stumbling along the road, hoping to find shelter or food, often dying alone. You notice that Napoleon himself remains with the army during these early weeks of retreat, though he travels with the Imperial Guard, the elite troops who are better supplied and disciplined than the rest of the army. He issues orders and maintains the pretense of command, but the reality is that the army is beyond his control. The retreat is no longer a military operation directed by a commanding general. It is a disaster unfolding according to the inexorable logic of cold, hunger, and exhaustion. Russian forces pursue the retreating French but cautiously. The regular Russian army, also suffering from the campaign's toll, does not press attacks aggressively. Instead, Cossacks and partisans harry the flanks and rear of the retreating columns. They capture stragglers, attack supply wagons, and create constant anxiety. The French cannot rest without fear of night attacks. They cannot forage effectively because Russian cavalry patrols the countryside. The harassment is not decisive in itself, but it adds to the cumulative stress that is destroying the army. The retreat passes through Smolensk in mid-November. The army hopes that Smolensk, established as a major supply depot, will provide relief. But Smolensk's supplies are inadequate for the number of men who converge on the city. The food stored there is quickly consumed. The city cannot provide shelter for everyone. Fighting breaks out among soldiers competing for resources. Smolensk provides a brief respite but does not solve the fundamental problem. The army is still deep in Russia, winter is intensifying, and hundreds of miles remain before reaching friendly territory. Leaving Smolensk, the army continues west toward the Berezina River. The cold becomes even more severe in late November. Temperatures fall to 20 or 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, exposed flesh freezes in minutes. Men who are wounded or who fall asleep die quickly. The suffering is beyond description, though you observe it from a distance that preserves calm narration. Each day, thousands more soldiers die or drop out of the columns, unable to continue. The army is evaporating, melting away without major battles, destroyed by cold and hunger. The non-French contingents of the Grand Army disintegrate first. German, Italian, and Polish soldiers desert in large numbers, seeking to escape the nightmare however they can. Austrians and Prussians, who were always unreliable, abandon the campaign entirely. Their corps withdraw from the retreat and head toward their home territories, declaring that their obligations to France have ended. Napoleon cannot prevent these defections. He lacks the force to compel cooperation, and the defecting troops are too numerous to stop. The Grand Army is becoming primarily French once again, but only because the non-French elements have abandoned it. By late November, as the army approaches the Berezina River, perhaps 50,000 men remain in some semblance of military organization. Tens of thousands more are scattered along the route, dying or struggling westward in small groups. This is less than 10% of the force that entered Russia in June. The attrition is staggering, one of the greatest military disasters in history, and it has occurred with relatively few major battles. The Grand Army has been destroyed primarily by logistics, geography, and climate, by the fundamental miscalculation that Russia could be conquered through conventional military operations. You arrive at the Berezina River in late November 1812, where the retreating Grand Army faces its most dangerous moment. The Berezina is not a particularly large river, but it is an obstacle that must be crossed, and the bridges have been destroyed. Russian forces are converging from multiple directions, attempting to trap the French against the river and destroy them completely. For several days, the outcome is uncertain. It is possible that the entire army will be captured or annihilated here. Napoleon's engineers perform remarkable work under terrible conditions. They construct 2 pontoon bridges across the partially frozen river, working in icy water that kills some from exposure. The bridges are completed on November 26, and the army begins crossing. The operation is chaotic. Thousands of soldiers and civilians, camp followers, refugees, families who have attached themselves to the army, crowd toward the bridges. The crossing takes several days as this mass of humanity flows across the narrow spans. Russian forces attack during the crossing, attempting to cut off the retreat. Artillery bombards the bridges and the approaches. Infantry assaults target the rear guard protecting the crossing. The rear guard, commanded by Marshal Ney, fights desperately to hold off the Russians while the rest of the army escapes. The fighting at the Berezina is intense, and thousands are killed, but the bridges hold. Most of the soldiers who reach the river manage to cross before the bridges are destroyed to prevent Russian pursuit. You observe that the Berezina crossing, often portrayed as a catastrophe, is actually a relative success given the circumstances. Napoleon's organizational ability and his subordinates' competence prevent complete disaster. The bridges are built, the army crosses, and Russian attempts at encirclement fail. Yet the cost is high. Perhaps 20,000 soldiers and camp followers die at the Berezina or in the immediate aftermath. Wounded are left behind because there is no way to transport them. Equipment is abandoned. The army that emerges on the West Bank is even more reduced and demoralized than before. After crossing the Berezina, the army continues retreating through late November and early December. The cold intensifies further. December 1812 is extraordinarily cold even by Russian standards. Temperatures fall to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. At these temperatures, metal burns bare skin. Breath freezes. Men die in their sleep from exposure. The suffering becomes almost beyond human endurance, yet those who survive continue moving west because stopping means death. The military organization of the army is now completely dissolved except for the Imperial Guard, which maintains some discipline. The rest of the army is a horde of refugees in military uniforms, moving west in hopes of reaching Poland and safety. They have ceased to be an army in any meaningful sense. They cannot fight battles. They cannot execute maneuvers. They can only trudge westward, hoping to survive one more day. This transformation from the Grand Army, the greatest military force in Europe, to a mob of freezing refugees occurs in less than 6 months. Napoleon himself makes a decision in early December to leave the army. He departs secretly on December 5th, taking a small escort and traveling by sleigh toward Paris. Officially, this is justified by the need to reach Paris quickly to manage political and diplomatic affairs. The disaster in Russia has become known in Europe, and Napoleon fears that enemies will exploit the situation if he is not present to manage events. But the departure also abandons the army in its moment of greatest suffering. Napoleon leaves the remaining soldiers to their fate while he saves himself. Command of the army passes to Murat, King of Naples and one of Napoleon's marshals. Murat will later abandon the army as well, as will many other senior commanders. The dissolution of command reflects the dissolution of the force itself. There is little that commanders can do at this point except try to preserve remnants and maintain some order among the survivors. The Grand Army has ceased to exist as a fighting force. What remains is a matter of survival, not military operations. You watch as the remnants of the army cross back into Poland in mid-December. Approximately 20,000 men in some semblance of military organization cross the border, along with perhaps 30 or 40,000 stragglers scattered across the region. These are the survivors of the 600,000 men who entered Russia 6 months earlier. The loss rate is over 90%. Some men are prisoners of war. Some have deserted and remain in Russia or have returned to their home countries independently. But most are dead, killed by combat, disease, starvation, or cold. The retreat from Russia is one of the greatest disasters in military history. The Russian army does not pursue aggressively beyond the border. The Russians are also exhausted. Their country has been devastated by the invasion and the campaign. They have achieved strategic victory by surviving and driving out the invader, but they are in no condition to immediately invade Central Europe. This provides Napoleon with a brief respite to rebuild his forces and prepare for the next phase of conflict. But the damage to French military power is immense and not easily repaired. News of the disaster spreads across Europe in December 1812 and January 1813. The 29th Bulletin of the Grand Army, issued in December, admits the scale of losses and blames the weather, claiming that the army was destroyed by an early and exceptionally severe winter rather than by Russian military action or French strategic errors. This attempt to deflect blame is partially true. The weather was indeed terrible, but it avoids the fundamental reality that the campaign was misconceived from the beginning, that invading Russia with inadequate logistical preparation was a strategic blunder that no amount of tactical brilliance could overcome. The survivors who reach Poland and eventually France carry with them the psychological trauma of what they experienced. Many are physically broken, having lost fingers or toes to frostbite, weakened by months of starvation, mentally scarred by the horrors of the retreat. These men will never fully recover. They tell stories of the Russian campaign that horrify those who hear them. The legend of Napoleon's invincibility is shattered. Europeans who feared French military power now realize that France is not invincible, that the Grand Army can be destroyed, that Napoleon is capable of catastrophic error. As you stand at the end of 1812, observing the wreckage of the Grand Army and the transformation of European politics that will follow, you recognize that this campaign marks the beginning of Napoleon's end. He will raise new armies, fight new campaigns, win new battles. But the aura of inevitable victory is gone. The strategic situation has fundamentally shifted. France's enemies now believe they can win, and that belief will drive the coalition wars that eventually destroy Napoleon's empire. The invasion of Russia is not the end of Napoleon's career, but it is the beginning of the end, the moment when strategic overreach converted dominance into vulnerability and set in motion the forces that will bring down the empire. You turn your attention now from the frozen roads of Russia to the chancelleries and palaces of Europe, where diplomats and monarchs observe the disaster and calculate their responses. The destruction of the Grand Army creates a strategic vacuum. For years, European states have accommodated Napoleon's dominance because they lacked the military power to resist. Now, suddenly, that calculation changes. France is weakened. Napoleon's military resources are depleted. The moment to challenge French hegemony has arrived. Prussia is the first to act decisively. Prussia was forced into alliance with France after its catastrophic defeats in 1806, compelled to contribute troops to the Russian campaign. Those Prussian troops, serving as a corps on the Grand Army's flank, withdraw from Russia relatively intact and return to Prussia. The Prussian military and political leadership, humiliated by years of subordination to France, seized the opportunity for revenge. On February 28, 1813, Prussia signs the Treaty of Kalisz with Russia, forming an alliance against France. The Prussian decision is momentous. Prussia is not a great power in the same sense as Russia or Austria, but it is substantial and strategically located. Prussian entry into the war means that France will face enemies on German soil, that the Rhine frontier is directly threatened. More importantly, Prussia's defection signals to other European states that the coalition against France is viable, that France can be defeated, that now is the time to act. The psychological effect is as important as the military contribution. Austria, which contributed troops to the Russian campaign under protest and which has grown increasingly resentful of French dominance, takes a more cautious approach. Austrian leadership, particularly Foreign Minister Metternich, understands that France weakened is desirable but France destroyed might be dangerous. Austria does not want Russia or Prussia to become too powerful. Metternich proposes himself as a mediator, offering to negotiate between France and the coalition. But while Austria negotiates, it also prepares for war, mobilizing troops and positioning forces to intervene when the moment is right. Britain continues to fund the coalition, providing subsidies to Russia, Prussia, and later Austria. British resources are crucial. Russia and Prussia are not wealthy states. They need financial support to maintain armies in the field. Britain has money generated by its commercial economy and its control of global trade. British subsidies pay for continental armies, allowing sustained military operations against France. This combination of British money and continental manpower creates the coalition that will eventually overwhelm Napoleon. You observe that Napoleon recognizes the danger and responds with characteristic energy. Upon returning to Paris in December 1812, he immediately begins raising a new army. Conscription is expanded, calling up younger men and recalling veterans. Arms and equipment are manufactured in emergency production. By spring 1813, Napoleon has assembled a force of perhaps 200,000 men. This is an impressive achievement, demonstrating Napoleon's organizational capabilities and France's resources. But these new soldiers are inexperienced, and France lacks the cavalry and artillery horses lost in Russia. The army is numerically substantial but qualitatively inferior to previous forces. The diplomatic situation is more challenging than the military rebuilding. Napoleon's satellite states are wavering. The Confederation of the Rhine, the collection of German states that has supported France, is questioning its allegiance. Bavaria, Saxony, and other German kingdoms are negotiating secretly with the coalition, preparing to switch sides when it appears safe. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon's Polish satellite, is occupied by Russian forces. The Kingdom of Italy is threatened from multiple directions. The empire's periphery is crumbling. In Spain, the Peninsular War continues to drain French resources. British forces under Wellington, supported by Spanish guerrillas and Portuguese troops, have driven French forces back from Portugal and are advancing into Spain. Napoleon needs to reinforce the army in Spain but cannot spare troops from the German theater. The Spanish ulcer, which has been bleeding French strength for years, continues to worsen. It is a second front that divides French resources and prevents concentration of force against the main threat in Germany. Napoleon attempts diplomacy, offering concessions to divide the coalition. He proposes returning some conquered territories, reducing French influence in Germany, accepting a more limited empire. But the coalition's terms are much more demanding. They want France reduced to its pre-revolutionary borders, all satellite states dissolved, all occupied territories evacuated. These terms are unacceptable to Napoleon, who would lose everything he has built. He rejects them and prepares for war, hoping that battlefield victories will force the coalition to moderate its demands. The spring campaign of 1813 begins in April. Napoleon marches into Germany with his new army and immediately demonstrates that his military skills remain formidable. He wins battles at Lutzen and Bautzen in May, defeating Russian and Prussian forces. These victories show that Napoleon can still outmaneuver and outfight his enemies in pitched battles. But the victories are not decisive. The coalition armies retreat but remain intact. Unlike previous campaigns, where Napoleon's victories shattered enemy armies and forced immediate peace negotiations, these victories achieve limited results. You notice a crucial difference from previous wars. In past campaigns, defeating one army often knocked a country out of the war, because single countries fielded single armies. Now, the coalition fields multiple armies, and defeating one does not eliminate that country from the conflict. Russia has several armies. Prussia can raise additional forces. Even if Napoleon wins battles, he cannot eliminate the opposition. The strategic situation has changed fundamentally. France faces a coalition with combined resources greater than its own, and military brilliance alone cannot overcome this disparity. An armistice is agreed in June 1813, ostensibly to negotiate peace but actually to allow both sides to reinforce and reposition. During this pause, Austria officially joins the coalition in August, declaring war on France. Austrian entry is decisive. Now France faces Russia, Prussia, Austria, Britain, Sweden, and various smaller states. The coalition's numerical superiority becomes overwhelming. Napoleon is outnumbered perhaps 2-1 or more. Even his genius cannot overcome these odds indefinitely. The autumn campaign of 1813 centers on Leipzig, where the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars occurs in mid-October. The Battle of Leipzig, sometimes called the Battle of Nations, involves over 500,000 soldiers, with the coalition armies converging from multiple directions to encircle Napoleon's forces. The battle lasts several days. Napoleon fights skillfully, but he is simply overwhelmed by numbers. On October 19th, French forces retreat from Leipzig, crossing the Elster River and abandoning Germany. The defeat at Leipzig has immediate consequences. Napoleon's German allies defect en masse. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolves. Bavaria, Saxony, and other states join the coalition. Napoleon's position in Germany collapses completely. He retreats across the Rhine into France, having lost all the territory he controlled east of the river. The empire beyond France's borders no longer exists. Within 1 year of the Russian disaster, Napoleon has lost his continental empire. As 1813 ends, coalition armies stand on the Rhine, preparing to invade France itself. Napoleon's strategic position is desperate. His armies are depleted. His allies have abandoned him. His enemies are united and confident. The financial resources available are inadequate for sustained warfare. France is exhausted after 20 years of revolution and war. The empire that seemed so permanent only 2 years earlier is collapsing rapidly. The invasion of Russia triggered this cascade, breaking the spell of invincibility and encouraging enemies to unite against France. The strategic overreach in 1812 has led directly to the strategic collapse in 1813. You move now into 1814, where the war comes to France itself. For the first time since the Revolution, foreign armies invade French territory in force. Coalition armies cross the Rhine in January, advancing into eastern France from multiple directions. Napoleon assembles what forces he can, perhaps 70,000 men, and conducts a defensive campaign that showcases his military brilliance one final time. But brilliance cannot overcome the fundamental disparity in resources. France is outnumbered, exhausted, and isolated. The campaign in France during early 1814 is known as the 6 Days Campaign, though it actually lasts several weeks. Napoleon moves rapidly, using interior lines to concentrate against separated coalition armies, defeating them in detail. He wins battles at Champaubat, Montmirail, Château-Thierry, and Vorchens in February, demonstrating that his tactical skills remain extraordinary. These victories slow the coalition advance and inflict significant casualties. For a moment, it appears Napoleon might repeat his earlier miracles, defending France against overwhelming odds. But the strategic situation is hopeless. Each victory exhausts Napoleon's limited forces. The coalition can afford losses because it has inexhaustible reserves. For every army Napoleon defeats, another advances from a different direction. He cannot be everywhere simultaneously. The coalition learns from experience, avoiding direct battles when possible and simply advancing around French positions. By early March, coalition forces are approaching Paris from multiple directions, and Napoleon cannot prevent their convergence. You observe that Napoleon's marshals and political advisors increasingly urge peace. They recognize that continuing the war will result in France's destruction. They fear that Napoleon's determination to fight to the end will leave France prostrate, occupied and partitioned. Some, particularly Talleyrand, begin negotiating secretly with the coalition, preparing for a post-Napoleonic settlement. The empire's leadership is fracturing under the strain of impending defeat. The coalition offers terms. Napoleon can abdicate and receive sovereignty over the island of Elba with a pension. The Bourbon monarchy will be restored in France under Louis XVIII, brother of the king executed during the Revolution. France will retain its pre-revolutionary borders and will not be required to pay massive indemnities or accept occupation. These terms are relatively generous, designed to end the war quickly and to prevent France from becoming so resentful that future wars are inevitable. The coalition wants stable peace, not revenge. Napoleon initially rejects these terms, proposing instead to abdicate in favor of his son, the King of Rome, with Marie-Louise as regent. This would preserve the Bonapartist dynasty while removing Napoleon personally from power. But the coalition refuses. They want Napoleon removed completely and the Bonapartist dynasty eliminated. They insist on Bourbon restoration as the only acceptable settlement. The negotiation becomes a matter of Napoleon's personal fate rather than France's political structure. Paris falls to coalition forces on March 31, 1814. The city surrenders without significant resistance. The government has fled. The population is exhausted and ready for peace. Coalition troops enter the city and are received without hostility. The symbolic importance is immense. Paris, the capital of the revolution, the heart of Napoleon's empire, occupied by foreign forces. This occupation makes clear that the war is over, that France has lost, that Napoleon's rule cannot continue. Napoleon's marshals confront him at Fontainebleau, where he has established headquarters south of Paris. They tell him bluntly that the army will not continue fighting, that further resistance is pointless and destructive. The Senate in Paris, manipulated by Talleyrand, has already declared Napoleon deposed and invited Louis XVIII to accept the crown. The political and military leadership has abandoned Napoleon. He is isolated, his authority gone. On April 6, 1814, Napoleon abdicates unconditionally. The act of abdication is signed at Fontainebleau, formally ending his reign as Emperor of the French. He is granted sovereignty over Elba, a small island off the coast of Tuscany, with an annual pension from the restored French government. He is allowed to keep the title of Emperor, though it now refers only to his tiny island domain. Marie-Louise and the King of Rome are sent to Austria, where they will live under Austrian protection. Napoleon will not see his son again. You watch as Napoleon departs for Elba in April, escorted by coalition commissioners and a small force of guards. The journey through France is difficult. In some regions, particularly in the south, crowds gather to denounce him, blaming him for years of war and suffering. Napoleon is nearly attacked by mobs and must be protected by his escort. The man who once commanded vast armies and ruled most of Europe is now a figure of contempt, blamed for disasters that his ambition created. The Bourbon restoration proceeds quickly. Louis XVIII enters Paris in May 1814 and accepts the throne. He grants a constitutional charter that acknowledges some revolutionary changes. There will be no return of feudalism, no restoration of confiscated church lands, no revival of the Ancien regime's social structure. But politically, France returns to monarchy. The revolutionary and Napoleonic period seems to have ended with restoration of the old dynasty. The Congress of Vienna convenes in September 1814 to reorganize Europe after Napoleon's defeat. Representatives of all major powers and many smaller states gather to redraw borders, settle territorial disputes, and establish a framework for maintaining peace. The Congress operates on principles of legitimacy and balance of power. Legitimate dynasties are restored where possible. No single power is allowed to dominate the continent as France did under Napoleon. The settlement is conservative, designed to prevent future revolutions and to maintain the social order that the French Revolution challenged. Yet the settlement cannot simply erase the previous 25 years. The ideas released by the revolution, popular sovereignty, national self-determination, constitutional government, legal equality, cannot be suppressed entirely. The administrative and legal reforms Napoleon introduced, particularly in Germany and Italy, have transformed those societies. The experience of French domination has stimulated national consciousness among Germans, Italians, and other peoples. The Europe of 1815 is fundamentally different from the Europe of 1789, despite the restoration of monarchies. Napoleon himself remains on Elba, ruling his tiny domain with the same attention to detail he applied to governing France. He reorganizes the island's administration, builds roads, creates a small court. But Elba is a prison, however gilded. Napoleon is only 45 years old, energetic and ambitious, unable to accept that his career is finished. He watches events in France carefully, learning that the Bourbon Restoration is unpopular, that many French people resent the return of émigrés and the influence of reactionary nobles. He receives visitors who report that the army remains loyal to his memory, that soldiers wear Napoleon's image secretly, that discontent is growing. In March 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba. The decision is rash, based on incomplete information and wishful thinking. But Napoleon has never accepted defeat easily. He lands in southern France with a small force and marches toward Paris. Instead of arresting him, troops sent to oppose him defect to his side. Marshal Ney, who had sworn loyalty to Louis XVIII, joins Napoleon with his forces. The Bourbon government panics. Louis XVIII flees Paris as Napoleon approaches. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon enters the Tuileries Palace without firing a shot and resumes power. This is the beginning of the 100 Days, the brief period when Napoleon attempts to rebuild his empire. But the return is doomed from the start. The European powers immediately declare Napoleon an outlaw and mobilize armies to invade France again. Napoleon attempts diplomacy, promises constitutional reform, tries to present himself as a changed man committed to peace and domestic improvement. But no one believes him. The coalition is determined to remove him permanently this time. You observe that Napoleon's only option is military victory. If he can defeat the coalition armies in detail before they unite, he might force a negotiated settlement that allows him to remain in power. He marches north into Belgium where British and Prussian armies are assembling. At Waterloo on June 18, 1815, he fights his final battle against the Duke of Wellington's British army. The battle is desperately close. For most of the day, the outcome is uncertain. But the arrival of Prussian reinforcements in the late afternoon turns the tide. The French army breaks and flees. Napoleon's last gamble has failed. You step back now from the narrative of events to reflect on what the invasion of Russia reveals about strategy, power, and human limitations. The Russian campaign is not an isolated incident but rather the culmination of tendencies inherent in Napoleon's approach to power. Understanding why the invasion failed requires examining not just tactical and logistical details but broader patterns of strategic decision-making and the limits those patterns impose. The fundamental error was strategic overreach, attempting to achieve objectives beyond the means available. Napoleon sought to enforce the continental system, to maintain economic warfare against Britain, by compelling Russian compliance through military force. The objective was arguably necessary within Napoleon's strategic framework. The continental system's credibility depended on universal enforcement. But the means required to achieve this objective, invading Russia with an army of 600,000 men across enormous distances in a single campaign season, exceeded what was practically achievable given the logistical and organizational capabilities of the era. Military historians have long studied the Russian campaign as a case study in logistics. The supply system failed not because of poor planning but because the task was impossible. Sustaining 600,000 men hundreds of miles from supply bases, across poor roads, through hostile territory, for months, was beyond the capacity of early 19th century technology and organization. Napoleon understood this intellectually. He spent months organizing supplies, but he did not accept it emotionally. He believed that determination and genius could overcome material constraints. They could not. You observe that this overconfidence was rooted in previous successes. Napoleon had repeatedly achieved what seemed impossible. He had conquered Italy as a young general with an undersupplied army. He had defeated Austria, Prussia, and Russia in campaigns that overcame numerical disadvantages through superior strategy. He had built an empire that dominated Europe. Each success reinforced his belief in his own ability to overcome obstacles. Russia was the point where this confidence exceeded reality, where the obstacles were genuinely insurmountable regardless of genius. The Russian campaign also reveals the importance of political objectives in warfare. Military operations must serve achievable political goals. Napoleon's political objective, forcing Russia to return to the continental system and accept French dominance, required Russian submission. But Tsar Alexander could not submit without losing credibility domestically. Russian nobles and military leaders would not accept surrender while Russian armies remained intact and while the enemy occupied only a fraction of Russian territory. The political objective was unachievable through military means because Russian autocracy provided strategic resilience that Napoleon's victories could not overcome. Geography played a crucial role. Russia's vastness transformed military operations. In compact European theaters, Battles occurred near capitals or major cities, and victory led to occupation of economically and politically vital regions. In Russia, vast distances separated the border from Moscow, and even capturing Moscow did not conquer Russia. The country's size provided strategic depth that absorbed French strength. The poor infrastructure limited movement and supply. The climate, particularly the early and severe winter of 1812, created environmental conditions that destroyed the army regardless of military skill. The campaign's outcome suggests limitations on military power in achieving political objectives. Military force can defeat armies, occupy territory, and destroy infrastructure. But it cannot compel societies to accept outcomes they fundamentally reject, particularly when those societies have the geographic and demographic resources to sustain resistance. Napoleon could defeat Russian armies in battle, but he could not force Russian society to accept continental system compliance or French dominance. The limits of military power as a tool of policy became starkly apparent in the frozen wastes of the Russian winter. You consider what alternative strategies might have existed. Napoleon could have accepted Russian defiance of the continental system, acknowledging that the blockade was imperfect but that attempting to enforce it militarily was too costly. This would have required abandoning a key element of his strategy against Britain, but it would have preserved French military strength and maintained European dominance. Alternatively, he could have invaded Russia with more modest objectives, occupying border regions, establishing a defensive line, and waiting for diplomatic opportunities. A limited operation might have been sustainable where total conquest was not. But these alternatives require accepting limitations that Napoleon's personality and strategic vision rejected. He had built his empire through boldness, through refusing to accept constraints, through repeatedly achieving what others thought impossible. Moderation and acceptance of limitations were foreign to his character. The invasion of Russia was consistent with his previous approach: confront obstacles directly, overcome them through audacity and skill, never accept that something is impossible. This approach had worked repeatedly until it encountered a challenge that genuinely exceeded what individual genius could overcome. The campaign's aftermath, the diplomatic collapse, the coalition's formation, the invasion of France, the abdication, all followed logically from the Russian disaster. The destruction of the Grand Army broke the spell of French invincibility and encouraged enemies to unite. The pattern is common in history: overextension leads to vulnerability, vulnerability encourages enemies, and enemies united can overcome what each feared to confront alone. The Russian campaign was not the only cause of Napoleon's fall. The Peninsular War, European nationalism, coalition unity, and British resources all contributed, but it was the decisive turning point, the moment when French dominance converted into French weakness. You reflect on how this pattern recurs throughout history. Powerful states and leaders, confident from previous successes, attempt operations beyond their means. Ancient Rome overextended its frontiers. Habsburg Spain exhausted itself in European wars. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in a campaign eerily similar to Napoleon's. In each case, leaders believed that willpower and military excellence could overcome material and geographic constraints. In each case, they were proven wrong. The limits of power are real, and attempting to exceed them leads to catastrophe. The invasion of Russia also demonstrates how single decisions can have cascading consequences. Napoleon's choice to invade in 1812 set in motion events that destroyed his empire within 3 years. The decision seemed logical at the time, based on strategic necessity and confidence in French military superiority. But it was founded on miscalculations about logistics, geography, Russian resilience, and the limits of military power. A different decision, accepting Russian defiance, waiting, seeking diplomatic solutions, might have preserved the empire for years or decades longer. But history does not offer opportunities to replay decisions with perfect information. As you conclude this long examination of the Russian campaign, you recognize that it represents one of history's clearest examples of strategic overreach. Napoleon possessed extraordinary military talents, but he attempted tasks that exceeded those talents' ability to deliver. He commanded vast resources, but he employed them in ways that exceeded their capacity to achieve objectives. He understood warfare profoundly, but he did not understand the limits that geography, climate, and logistics impose regardless of military brilliance. The invasion of Russia was the beginning of the end because it revealed these limits publicly and dramatically, shattering the illusion of invincibility and encouraging enemies to unite against a power they now recognized as vulnerable. The campaign's legacy extends beyond Napoleon's immediate defeat. It influenced military thinking for generations, teaching caution about overextension and respect for logistics. It contributed to the 19th century balance of power system, where no single state would be allowed to dominate as France had under Napoleon. It demonstrated that geography and climate could be more powerful than armies, that Russia's vastness provided natural defenses that military force could not overcome. These lessons shaped European strategic thinking through the 19th and into the 20th century, when another dictator would learn them again at catastrophic cost. The invasion of Russia thus becomes not just an episode in Napoleon's career but a fundamental lesson about the limits of power and the dangers of overreaching, a lesson that history teaches repeatedly to those willing to listen but that ambitious leaders repeatedly fail to learn.